There are crimes that don't erupt in a moment of chaos. They are planned, structured, and executed like machinery. From the burning sands of Syria to the icy plains of Eastern Europe, from the killing fields of Southeast Asia to the quiet towns of Central Africa, 5 genocides have forced humanity to redefine what it means to be civilized. The word genocide did not exist before the 20th century. It was coined in 1944 by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who tried to describe what he saw, the deliberate destruction of a people, not by accident, but by design. Each of the cases you are about to hear, Armenia, Europe under the Nazis, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, shares the same anatomy: an ideology that divides, a government that enables, and a silence that allows the killing to spread. Over the next hour, we will walk through more than 100 years of human cruelty, how 5 nations descended into planned annihilation, how millions were marked for death, and how, in the end, justice came too late for most of them. This is Dark Crimes Real, where every atrocity leaves a trace. In the early years of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was already collapsing. Centuries of internal decay, ethnic divisions, and the pressure of European powers had left it fragile and afraid. Inside this empire lived about 2 million Armenians, a Christian minority whose ancestors had inhabited Anatolia long before the Turks arrived. They spoke their own language, practiced their own faith, and by the early 1900s, many had become merchants, teachers, and civil servants. But their success made them targets. In the eyes of Ottoman nationalists, the Armenians were foreigners within their own land, an obstacle to the dream of a unified Muslim Turkish nation. Decades of distrust had already boiled over once before. In the 1890s, under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the first mass killings of Armenians took place, leaving hundreds of thousands dead. Yet the world moved on, and the empire remained. When the Young Turks seized power in 1908, they promised reform and equality. Instead, they replaced the old tyranny with a new ideology, one built on ethnic purity and fear of disintegration. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire had entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. At the same time, the Russian army was advancing across the eastern border. In that climate of panic, the government in Constantinople began to treat every Armenian as a potential traitor. They were accused of collaborating with Russia, of plotting rebellion, of threatening the state's survival. The decision that followed was not taken in a moment of rage. It was drafted in meetings, stamped by ministries, and disguised as law. On the night of April 24, 1915, Ottoman police swept through Constantinople and arrested more than 200 Armenian intellectuals, doctors, priests, and politicians. They were deported into the interior of Anatolia and murdered along the way. That night became the signal for a wider purge. Within weeks, soldiers and local militias were ordered to begin relocations. The temporary law of deportation, the Techir Law, made it legal to remove Armenians from their homes under the pretext of military security. In reality, it was the blueprint for annihilation. Entire villages were surrounded at dawn. Men were taken away first, marched to nearby ravines, and shot. Women, children, and the elderly were forced to gather what they could carry before being herded south. Columns of tens of thousands began to move along the dust roads of Anatolia. Witnesses described the air filled with the cries of infants and the stench of death. Few knew their destination, the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia, hundreds of kilometers away. Those journeys became known as the death marches. There were no supplies, no water, no shelter. Guards were ordered to let starvation and exhaustion do the killing. Bands of armed men, some organized by local officials, attacked the convoys, taking what little the deportees carried and leaving their bodies on the roadside. In places like Malatya, Harput, and Aleppo, the ground was littered with bones. Down the Euphrates River, survivors spoke of bodies floating in the current for miles. At Deir ez-Zor, deep in the Syrian desert, entire camps of Armenians simply disappeared. By late 1916, the Ottoman Interior Ministry had declared the Armenian question solved. Foreign diplomats and missionaries tried to raise alarm. The American ambassador, Henry Morgenthau Sr., sent cables describing a campaign of race extermination. British and French newspapers reported the massacres, calling them crimes against humanity, but the world was already drowning in the First World War. No army came. No intervention followed. The killing ran its course in silence. When the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire fell. The new Turkish nationalist movement under Mustafa Kemal sought to distance itself from the old regime, but refused to accept blame. Some of the young Turk leaders fled abroad. A few were tried in absentia, others assassinated by Armenian vigilantes years later. By 1923, with the birth of the Republic of Turkey, the last remnants of the Armenian population in Anatolia had vanished. More than 1,000 towns and villages were emptied. Of the 2 million Armenians who had lived under Ottoman rule, only a fraction remained. The rest were dead or scattered across the world, from Lebanon to France, from the United States to the far corners of the Soviet Union. The final toll will never be known. Historians estimate between 600,000 and 1.5 million people were killed through executions, starvation, or forced marches. Behind those numbers were families erased, churches left in ruins, and cultural heritage wiped from maps. An entire civilization was uprooted from its homeland. In the aftermath, the world searched for words to describe what had happened. It would take nearly 30 years before a Polish Jewish scholar named Raphael Lemkin coined a new term, genocide, to capture the deliberate destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. When asked why he had invented the word, Lemkin replied, "Because of the Armenians." Today, the story remains divided by politics and denial. Some governments still avoid the term, afraid of diplomatic fallout. But for survivors and their descendants, the evidence is carved into memory, in the photographs of the marches, in the letters sent from Aleppo, in the silence of the abandoned churches. Every April 24th, Armenians around the world light candles and read the names of the cities that no longer exist. The Armenian Genocide ended not with liberation, but with erasure. The empire that committed it disappeared, yet its shadow remained, a blueprint for how a state can destroy its own citizens while the world looks away. And it was a warning the world would ignore. Just 20 years later, another regime would study the same methods: registration, deportation, concentration, extermination, and apply them on a scale the world had never seen.
When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Germany was a wounded nation. The Great War had ended in defeat. The economy had collapsed, and millions longed for someone to blame. The Nazi Party offered a simple answer: that Germany had been betrayed by outsiders, by racial enemies, and above all by the Jews. It was not a new hatred, but Hitler gave it structure, law, and the machinery of the state. The first phase of the Holocaust did not involve killing. It began with exclusion. Newspapers and radio spread the language of contempt. Posters appeared on streets warning Jews not welcome. In 1935, the regime passed the Nuremberg Laws, stripping Jews of citizenship, banning marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and defining identity by bloodline. To be Jewish was no longer a matter of faith, it was a matter of race. For 6 years, discrimination grew into persecution. Jewish shops were vandalized, property seized, and thousands were forced to emigrate. On the night of November 9, 1938, mobs organized by the Nazi Party attacked synagogues and businesses across Germany and Austria. The event became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. At least 90 people were murdered, and 30,000 men were sent to early concentration camps. The message was clear: there was no longer a place for Jews in Germany. When war erupted in September 1939, Germany expanded eastward. Poland fell within weeks, bringing more than 2 million Jews under German control. In the occupied territories, the Nazis established ghettos, walled sections of cities where Jewish residents were forced to live in cramped, starving conditions. Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, each became a prison. Disease spread, and thousands died before a single shot was fired. But the ghettos were not the final goal. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Behind the front lines came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units tasked with eliminating Jews, Roma, and communist officials. They rounded up men, women, and children, marched them to the outskirts of towns, and executed them in groups. In ravines like Babi Yar, near Kyiv, more than 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941. Mass shootings were efficient, but not efficient enough. The Nazi leadership wanted a system that could kill faster, in greater numbers, and without the emotional burden on the killers. In January 1942, senior officials met outside Berlin at the Wannsee Conference. There, they coordinated what they called the final solution to the Jewish question: the systematic extermination of all Jews in Europe. Trains would carry deportees from every occupied country to killing centers in the East. By the summer of that year, a network of death camps was operating at full capacity. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, in southern Poland, the railway tracks ended beside a gate marked with the words "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. Each train brought thousands of people. Upon arrival, SS doctors stood on the platform and made a simple gesture: left or right. One side went to forced labor. The other went directly to the gas chambers. Zyklon B pellets dropped through ceiling vents released cyanide gas. Within 20 minutes, everyone inside was dead. Their bodies were burned in crematoria, the ashes scattered in pits or rivers. By 1945, over 1.1 million people had been killed at Auschwitz alone. Other camps followed the same design. Treblinka, where about 870,000 were murdered. Sobibor and Belzec, each claiming hundreds of thousands. Few survived to tell what happened. The camps were not places of imprisonment. They were factories built to erase human life. Back in the ghettos, resistance still flickered. In April 1943, as German forces moved to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish fighters launched an armed uprising. They held out for nearly a month before being crushed. 13,000 were killed, and the ghetto was burned to the ground. Yet their defiance became a symbol of dignity in the face of annihilation. By late 1944, the war was turning against Germany. As Soviet and Allied armies advanced, the SS began dismantling camps and forcing prisoners on death marches deeper into the Reich. Thousands died on the roadside from exhaustion or were shot for collapsing. In January 1945, Soviet troops reached Auschwitz. What they found defied comprehension. Warehouses filled with hair, shoes, and personal belongings of the murdered. The true scale of the killing began to surface. Across Europe, an estimated 6 million Jews had been murdered, 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe. Another 5 million victims, Roma, Slavs, the disabled, political prisoners, and homosexuals, perished under the same system. Entire families, languages, and traditions were extinguished. The Holocaust was not the product of chaos. It was bureaucracy turned into genocide. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Allies convened the Nuremberg trials to prosecute Nazi leaders. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity were recognized in international law. Yet for the survivors, justice could never match the loss. Camps became memorials. Witnesses gave testimony, trying to make the world believe what had happened behind the barbed wire. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The word itself, genocide, had been forged from the ashes of Auschwitz and the silence of Deir ez-Zor. It was meant to ensure that such crimes would never happen again. But as history would soon prove, the promise of never again was fragile. The Holocaust was the ultimate warning how a modern, educated society could transform prejudice into a system of industrial killing. Its methods, its language, and even its denial would echo in every genocide that followed. 30 years later, far from Europe, another regime would rise, one that turned its own citizens into enemies and fields into graves. When Phnom Penh fell to the Khmer Rouge in April 1975, the world expected liberation. Instead, it witnessed the birth of Year Zero. Pol Pot's new regime promised equality and purity, but its first act was to empty every city. Loudspeakers ordered the evacuation. Leave immediately. The Americans will bomb the capital. Within hours, 2 million people poured into the highways under the burning sun. Children carried bundles larger than their bodies. The sick were pulled on carts or left to die in hospital beds. Anyone who refused to leave was shot on the spot. The roads became rivers of dust and suffering. People walked for days without food or water, collapsing beside the corpses of those who had fallen before them. The Khmer Rouge called it the evacuation of the parasites. It was the beginning of a plan to remake society through destruction, to erase class, religion, and memory itself. When the cities were emptied, Cambodia became a nation of silent fields. The new rulers divided the population into groups called cooperatives. Families were separated. Names were replaced by numbers. From sunrise to sunset, men, women, and children dug canals, harvested rice, and built dikes with bare hands. They worked 12, sometimes 16 hours a day under watchtowers and rifles. Food rations were a few spoonfuls of watery porridge. Anyone who showed weakness was labeled an enemy. People began to whisper a new phrase, to be taken away, which meant to vanish forever. The Khmer Rouge called themselves Ankar, the organization. It was an invisible authority that saw everything. They outlawed religion. Monks were forced to sweep temples before being executed. Teachers, doctors, engineers, anyone who wore glasses or spoke a foreign language were considered contaminated by the old world. Confession meant death. Denial meant torture first. In Phnom Penh, a former high school named Tuol Sleng became Security Prison 21, known as S21. There, thousands of prisoners were photographed before interrogation. Their faces, young, old, terrified, would later become the archive of a nation's suffering. Inside its classrooms, desks were replaced with iron beds and chains. Interrogators beat prisoners with sticks, electric wires, or the butts of rifles. Others were hung upside down, their heads plunged into water until they lost consciousness. Prisoners were forced to confess to crimes they had never committed, espionage, betrayal, foreign allegiance, and then sign their own death warrants. At night, trucks transported the condemned to Choyang, one of hundreds of execution sites, later called killing fields. There, under the cover of darkness and loud revolutionary music, the executions began. To save bullets, guards used machetes, hammers, or bamboo sticks. Victims were ordered to kneel beside open pits before being struck at the back of the head. Some were buried alive. Witnesses later recalled how the earth still moved for days afterward, as if the ground itself was breathing. Infants were killed before their mothers' eyes, smashed against trees to eliminate future enemies. The smell of blood and decay hung in the humid air. Even birds avoided flying overhead. Across Cambodia, thousands of similar sites existed. Each commune had its own security center, its own graves. People were executed for stealing a handful of rice, for praying, for crying, for dreaming aloud about food. Starvation was as deliberate as execution. In work camps, the weak were denied rations, their deaths counted as proof of revolutionary efficiency. Bodies were left unburied. During monsoon rains, bones surfaced through the soil, a landscape of white and red. Between 1975 and 1979, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people died, nearly 1 in every 4 Cambodians. Whole communities disappeared, the Cham Muslims forced to eat pork or be killed, Vietnamese and Chinese minorities massacred or expelled, educated elites wiped out entirely. Even loyal members of the Khmer Rouge were not spared. Paranoia devoured its own revolution. At Tuol Sleng alone, nearly 14,000 people entered. Only 12 walked out alive. Foreigners were barred from entering, and journalists who tried were never seen again. From the outside, Cambodia seemed closed but stable, a country lost behind slogans of agriculture and unity. Inside, people whispered in fear. They no longer trusted even their own children, who were trained to inform on parents. The nights were silent except for the occasional truck, headlights off, carrying those who would not return. By late 1978, border clashes with Vietnam escalated into full war. Khmer Rouge units massacred Vietnamese civilians in villages along the frontier. The retaliation was swift and absolute. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh. They found empty streets, broken hospitals, and warehouses filled with skulls. The Khmer Rouge fled to the jungle, leaving behind a nation of ghosts. When the survivors emerged, the scale of destruction defied imagination. Mass graves dotted the countryside. Families dug with their hands, searching for bones that might belong to someone they loved. Crops had withered, irrigation canals clogged with skeletons. Children wandered through villages calling for parents who would never answer. The world had turned away, and the killers had nearly succeeded in erasing an entire civilization. Pol Pot escaped into the forests near the Thai border. He would die in 1998, never facing a court. His comrades, Nuon Chea, Khieu Sampan, and Kain Guek Ave, the commandant of S-21, were eventually tried by the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, found guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity, but no verdict could restore what was lost. The Cambodian genocide was different from the industrialized killing of Europe. It required no gas chambers, no trains, no machinery. It relied on ideology, obedience, and fear. One order, one blow, one life at a time. The hands that killed were those of neighbors, classmates, even children. It proved that when a regime convinces its people that purity requires blood, ordinary men and women can become executioners. Today, Cambodia still bears the scars. At Choyang, the trees whisper in the wind, the air thick with incense and sorrow. At Tuol Sleng, faces stare from the walls, thousands of eyes frozen at the moment between life and death. Every year the soil releases new bones, as if the earth refuses to forget. Near the outskirts of the capital, they found the fields. Mounds of earth cracked open by the heat revealed bones tangled with scraps of clothing. In one pit, a child's skull rested beside a woman's dress. It was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard that stretched to the horizon. The soldiers had come to fight a war. 4 years of terror ended only when another nation intervened, but the world's silence had already condemned millions. And as survivors rebuilt their shattered lives, a new war in another part of the world was beginning, one that would test humanity's promise of never again once more.
When Yugoslavia collapsed in the early 1990s, its republics began to break apart. But in Bosnia and Herzegovina, independence came with a cost. The country's population was divided among 3 main groups: Bosniaks, who were Muslim, Croats, who were Catholic, and Serbs, who were Orthodox Christians. When Bosnia declared independence in March 1992, nationalist leaders from the Serb community rejected the decision. Armed and supported by the neighboring Republic of Serbia, they launched a campaign to carve out their own state, one cleansed of non-Serbs. The war that followed was brutal and complex, but beneath the shifting front lines, one strategy dominated: the systematic removal of entire populations. The world would later call it ethnic cleansing. Villages were surrounded, men separated from women, civilians detained in camps, homes burned, mosques shelled, and churches destroyed. It was a methodical process, carried out not in rage, but in cold administrative precision. Its purpose was to erase every trace of coexistence that had once defined Bosnia. From 1992 onward, the map filled with names that would become synonymous with horror: Prijedor, Foča, Visegrad, Zvornik. In Prijedor, thousands of Bosniaks and Croats were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, such as Omarska, Karaterm, and Ternopole. Television images smuggled out by journalists showed men emaciated behind barbed wire, their ribs protruding like shadows of Auschwitz. In Foča, women and girls were detained in hotels and schools, turned into centers of systematic rape, an instrument of humiliation and control. Entire towns were emptied, the residents bussed away or executed. By the end of 1993, tens of thousands were dead and more than 1 million displaced. The international community responded with hesitation. United Nations peacekeepers were deployed, but bound by rules that forbade engagement. The world watched as cities like Sarajevo endured years of siege, snipers shooting at civilians from the surrounding hills, shells raining down on markets and playgrounds. Yet the worst was still to come. In July 1995, the small mountain town of Srebrenica became the center of a tragedy that would redefine genocide in modern Europe. Declared a safe area by the United Nations, Srebrenica was supposed to be protected by Dutch peacekeepers. Within its borders, around 40,000 Bosniak refugees sought shelter, many already displaced from other regions. Food was scarce, the air thick with fear. Outside the perimeter, Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic prepared to strike. On July 6th, the shelling began. Within days, Serb troops entered the town. Civilians panicked, rushing toward the UN compound in Potorici, begging for help. But the peacekeepers were outnumbered and under orders not to fight. Mladic himself entered the compound, shaking hands with the UN commander for the cameras, promising evacuation and safety. It was a lie captured on film. Men and boys were separated from women under the pretext of screening for war criminals. Buses carried women and children away, many raped along the road, while the men were taken to fields, warehouses, and schools. Over the next week, from July 11th to July 22nd, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were executed.
They were lined up in rows, hands bound, shot in the back of the head. Some were forced to dig their own graves, others were herded into barns and machine-gunned. The bodies were bulldozed into mass pits, later dug up again by Serb forces to hide the evidence. The stench of death hung over the forest for weeks. Those who tried to flee through the woods faced ambushes and traps. Columns of refugees, thousands long, stumbled through mines and gunfire. Some committed suicide rather than be captured. It was the largest massacre in Europe since World War II. When the first satellite images and survivor testimonies reached the outside world, the illusion of peacekeeping collapsed. NATO launched limited airstrikes in August 1995, targeting Serb positions. At the same time, Croatian and Bosnian forces advanced on the ground, forcing the Serb leadership to negotiate. In December that year, the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed, ending the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the cost was immense. Around 90,000 people killed, more than 2 million displaced, and a country scarred by partition. In the years that followed, investigators began exhuming the mass graves around Srebrenica. They uncovered bones, blindfolds, and bullet casings scattered across the hills. Forensic teams from around the world used DNA analysis to identify the remains, a process that continues even today. Each identification was a piece of truth that could no longer be denied. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague prosecuted dozens of war criminals. Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, the political and military architects of the genocide, were convicted of crimes of humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2007, the International Court of Justice formally declared that the massacre at Srebrenica constituted genocide. It was the first legal recognition of genocide on European soil since the Holocaust. Yet denial still lingers. Some politicians call it a tragedy of war, not a crime of intent. For the survivors, denial is another wound that never heals. Each July, thousands gather at the Srebrenica Memorial Cemetery in Potarici. The white markers stretch in perfect rows across the green valley. Every year, newly identified remains are laid to rest beside those already buried. The silence is absolute, broken only by the recitation of names, a litany of loss. The Bosnian Genocide revealed that even in an age of global communication and international law, mass murder could still unfold before the world's eyes. The blue helmets of the United Nations stood close enough to see, but too constrained to act. Technology had advanced since the 1940s, but human indifference had not. Bosnia's war ended with signatures and borders, but the trauma remains alive in its soil. The rivers and hills still hold secrets, bones not yet found, stories not yet told. The promise of never again was broken once more. Not by ignorance, but by hesitation. And less than 1 year later, that hesitation would resurface on another continent, this time in Africa, where a genocide would erupt and end before the world even decided to intervene. In the heart of Africa, in a country smaller than the state of Maryland, nearly 1 million people were murdered in just 100 days. It happened not in secret, but in the open, in churches, schools, and on roads where neighbors killed neighbors, while the world watched and did nothing. It was called the Rwandan Genocide. The roots of the slaughter ran deep. For centuries, the people of Rwanda, the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Twa, lived together under a single kingdom. Their differences were more social than ethnic. But during colonial rule, first by Germany and then Belgium, those differences were turned into a hierarchy. The colonizers favored the minority Tutsi, portraying them as more noble, while branding the majority Hutu as laborers. Identity cards were issued, labeling every citizen by ethnicity. What had once been fluid became fixed, and resentment began to grow. After independence in 1962, power shifted to the Hutu majority. Years of revenge and repression followed. Tens of thousands of Tutsis were killed or fled into exile, forming communities in Uganda, Burundi, and Zaire. Among them, a generation of exiles grew up, dreaming of return. By 1990, these exiles had formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, a rebel army led by Paul Kagame. When they invaded from Uganda, the Rwandan government, dominated by hardline Hutu extremists, used the conflict to fuel fear. They warned the population that the Tutsis were planning to enslave them again. Propaganda filled the airwaves and newspapers. One station, Radio Télévision des Mille Collines, became the voice of hatred, calling Tutsis inyenzi, cockroaches, and urging listeners to crush them. On the evening of April 6, 1994, a plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, was shot down near Kigali. No one survived. Within hours, the government and the military blamed the Tutsis. Roadblocks appeared across the capital. Lists of names had already been prepared. The killings began before dawn. First, the Presidential Guard and the Interahamwe militia targeted political opponents and moderate Hutus who favored peace. Then they turned on the Tutsi. Men with machetes, clubs, and guns went door to door. Entire families were dragged into the streets. Women were raped, children beaten to death. Churches that once offered refuge became slaughterhouses. In the parish of Nyamata, more than 10,000 people were killed in a single week. At Nyarubwe, the massacre lasted for days. Survivors described how grenades and machetes tore through the crowded church. Those still breathing were finished off with clubs. Everywhere, the killers sang patriotic songs as they worked. In Kigali, the capital, the streets filled with the smell of blood and smoke. Bodies piled along the roadsides. The Interahamwe militia set up checkpoints, demanding to see ID cards. If the card said Tutsi, the person was dragged aside and killed on the spot. Rivers became red with bodies. The Kagera River carried the dead into Lake Victoria, so many that Tanzanian fishermen complained they could no longer cast their nets. The genocide was not chaos, it was planned. Local officials, police, and priests kept lists, organized militias, and provided trucks, fuel, and tools. Radio broadcasts gave instructions on where to find survivors. The killings spread to the countryside with terrifying speed. By May, more than 500,000 people were dead. Inside the country, a small number of people tried to resist. Some Hutus hid their Tutsi neighbors, at great risk to their own lives. Many were killed alongside them. Outside Rwanda, the world debated the word genocide. The United Nations had peacekeepers on the ground, a small force under Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, but they were forbidden to intervene. Requests for reinforcements were denied. As machetes cut through flesh, diplomats argued over definitions. The Security Council reduced its troops instead of increasing them. In the chaos, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Kagame, began advancing from the north. Village by village, they fought their way toward Kigali. They found roads littered with corpses, schools filled with bones, and churches soaked in blood. Survivors emerged from the marshes, dazed and skeletal. By July 4, 1994, the RPF had captured the capital. 2 weeks later, they declared a ceasefire. The genocide was over. In 100 days, between 800,000 and 1 million people had been killed, mostly Tutsi, and tens of thousands of Hutu moderates. When the killing stopped, Rwanda was a graveyard. The stench of death clung to the air for months. dogs fed on unburied bodies. Fields were filled with skulls and bones. In the aftermath, more than 2 million Hutus, including many perpetrators, fled across the border into Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, setting the stage for years of regional conflict. International reaction came too late. The United Nations and major powers expressed regret but avoided responsibility. Later, inquiries admitted failure. One official report called it a sin of indifference. In 1995, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was established in Arusha, Tanzania, to prosecute those most responsible. Dozens were convicted, including government ministers, army officers, and radio broadcasters. Inside Rwanda, community courts known as Gacaca tried thousands more. But justice, as many survivors said, could never balance the scale. The genocide left a scar that could not be measured in numbers alone. Entire families vanished. Villages were emptied. Children grew up with no memory of their parents, only of the screams. Even today, survivors describe the sound of insects at dusk as a memory trigger, a reminder of the nights when killers hunted with flashlights and machetes. Rwanda has since rebuilt. Kigali is clean, modern, and orderly, but beneath its calm surface lies the memory of 1994, the year when neighbors turned into executioners and the world turned away. Every April, the country holds a week of remembrance. Flames are lit, names are read aloud. The smoke drifts upward like a plea to the living. Remember what silence allows. The Rwandan Genocide proved that atrocity no longer required armies or ideology on a global scale, only words, fear, and the will to dehumanize. In the space of 3 months, a nation devoured itself, while the rest of humanity debated what to call it. It was the final echo in a century that began with the Armenians and ended with Rwanda. 5 acts of extermination that defined the darkest chapters of modern history. And though each happened in a different place, under a different flag, they were all born from the same seed, the belief that some lives matter less than others. Across a century, the word genocide has been written in blood and silence. From the deserts of Anatolia to the forests of Poland, from the rice fields of Cambodia to the valleys of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and finally to the hills of Rwanda, the pattern never truly changed. A government names an enemy. Neighbors become executioners. The world hesitates. And when the killing ends, the silence begins. Each of these 5 genocides was different in time, place, and method, but all shared the same anatomy. First came words, subtle, repeated, corrosive. Then laws, separating the pure from the impure. Then orders, plans, and transports. And finally, the graves. The victims were Armenians, Jews, Cambodians, Bosniaks, Tutsis, but the crime was always the same: the deliberate destruction of a people, not for what they had done, but for who they were. In every case, the world said never again, and yet again and again it looked away, bound by politics, fear, or disbelief. The photographs of the dead filled archives, the testimonies filled courtrooms, but the lessons faded each time the headlines changed. The machinery of hatred waited, patient and familiar, for the next spark. Today, the word genocide is part of our vocabulary, but its repetition has dulled its meaning. We remember the numbers, but not the faces. We count the bodies, but forget the warning. The truth is that genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with language, with the decision to divide, to name someone other. It begins when ordinary people stop seeing one another as human. If there is a single thread connecting the Armenians of 1915, the Jews of 1942, the Cambodians of 1977, the Bosniaks of 1995, and the Tutsis of 1994, it is this: each time the victims were told their deaths were necessary for purity, for unity, for peace, and each time the world waited until it was too late. The memorials now stand in every continent: the bones in Cambodia, the shoes in Auschwitz, the names carved in stone at Srebrenica, the candles in Kigali. They are not monuments to the past. They are warnings to the present. Because genocide is not history. It is a possibility that exists whenever hate is allowed to organize itself. In the end, remembrance is not about anger. It is about vigilance. To remember is to take responsibility, not for the crimes, but for ensuring they are never repeated. For silence is not peace. It is complicity. This is Dark Crimes Real, where every atrocity leaves a trace, and the world's darkest truths are remembered, not to keep hate alive, but to keep humanity awake. If you found this story meaningful, please like, comment, and share. And don't forget to subscribe to Dark Crimes Real for new videos every day at 7 p.m.